Hi, Bones here from Bones Art Studio, where we discuss all things art. And today's video is part 2 in a series on color mixing, designed to help make color mixing something you look forward to and enjoy rather than something you dread and avoid. Before we go on over to the palette, let's go over today's objectives. So today we have 4 objectives. Our first objective is to get comfortable mixing while using a limited palette. That is the 3 primary colors plus white. The second is to get comfortable with mixing a chromatic black from the 3 primaries with the understanding that there are other ways to mix beautiful blacks using some different pigments, which I would encourage you to explore at some point, but not at the moment. Do that after you're comfortable mixing with and learning the limits of a limited palette that is using only the 3 primary colors plus white. The third objective is to get comfortable recognizing whether a color note is possible to match exactly, or if it's one that you're going to have to say, well, I'm going to settle to get, this is, close enough. And I'm going to say that's probably as close as I can get. Once you start mixing with a limited palette and you get used to how you're using these different pigments, a light bulb is going to go off and you're going to say, whoa, my limited palette can never reach the chroma at that value, right? Most of the time when you can't hit the note exactly, it's usually because it has something to do with a little bit more intensity and chroma than you can get with your palette. And sometimes it's a matter of how we mix the colors, and other times it's simply just a matter of, with this palette, I'm not going to be able to match that note exactly. But you also have to learn close enough is good enough sometimes. So that's number 3. And number 4 is, the fourth objective is to get more efficient / faster at matching color notes and knowing when you're at that place where this is probably as close as I'm going to get with this palette. So those are our 4 primary objectives: to get comfortable mixing, using the primary palette, mixing a chromatic black from the 3 primaries, to get comfortable recognizing whether a color note is possible to match exactly or if we have to settle, and just to get more efficient or faster at color mixing and matching notes. Now, everything is also relative, so matching a note is relative to what is going on your substrate, on your canvas, on your paper, on your panel, whatever it is. So bear that in mind also. Sometimes we work trying to match exactly what we see in nature, and other times we know, for instance, that we're just not going to be able to match a note. So we get as close as we can to a note, and everything else we relate to that limitation. Okay? I don't know if I'm doing a great job of explaining it right now, but I don't want to get too involved in that aspect of painting quite yet. What I'd like to do today is go on over to the palette and get started with our objectives. And the first objective is mixing a black. So let's go on over there. And here we are at the palette. Okay. So, oh, I see my blue is falling. Let's move that back up. Okay. So, I will just reiterate quickly the pigments that I am using on this palette. And you don't have to use the exact pigments that I'm using. You can use any of the various iterations of a yellow, a red, and a blue. I would, however, try to stay as neutral as possible. By that I mean, when you're choosing a red, choose a red that doesn't skew either orange, like doesn't skew yellow, and doesn't skew blue. When you're choosing a yellow, choose one that doesn't skew red or doesn't skew blue. And the blue, actually, I would recommend starting with Ultramarine Blue, but it doesn't have to be, but I would recommend a dark-ish blue because you want to be able to mix a black. And that is only where we're going to start. You don't have to stick with this palette, but I do recommend that for the blue, you stick with an ultramarine. So what I'm using today is a mixing white, which is not quite as strong as a pure titanium white. Titanium white has a very high tinting strength. I'm using something with a little bit of a lower tinting strength, which is called a soft mixing white. I am using a Cadmium Yellow Medium Hue. The hue means it's not an actual cadmium pigment. It is a dye, and that's fine. I also recommend, if you are on a limited budget, which most of us are, when you are learning, because I would rather see you mix a lot of paint and waste it than be hesitant about mixing paint because it is so expensive, use a cadmium hue if you have to. There will be a slight transition when you are ready to make a transition to a pure cadmium color, but for now I would say start with a Cadmium Yellow Medium Hue, which is what I'm using here. And I'm also using a Cadmium Red Medium Hue and an Ultramarine Blue. Okay, so let's start with our first objective, which is mixing a chromatic black using our, I'm going to stay out of that white. There's a little bit of white. I don't want to get white right now into our black. So we're going to mix a black from our primary palette using all three of our primary colors. Now, I do not recommend you think formulaically, so I would like you to take what I am going to say with a grain of salt. It is a black, therefore we know we are going to have to use a lot of dark color. We need a lot. By that I mean in relation to the red and the yellow. We need a lot more blue. Don't think about it as, oh, I'm going to use a third blue, a third red, a third yellow. We're not really doing that. We have to do this based on tinting strength. But we also know it needs to be dark. We're mixing a black, so we need a lot more blue. So let's start with a fair amount of blue, some red, not as much red, and some yellow, also not as much yellow. In fact, if we wanted to, we could mix the red and the yellow by itself and create an orange just to see where we fall in there, but we don't have to. We may need more yellow. We may need more yellow. Let's see. Let's see. Let's start mixing and see where it goes, because we don't want to look, again, like I said, at this as being a formulaic process, because it's better to get used to just using your eyes and your sensibilities for what you're seeing in front of you and knowing what your target is and identifying what it's going to take to reach that target. So I'm going to mix a little bit more because I feel like part of this is mixed well. So right now it is skewing too blue to my eye, and it's not really a black. It would work as a black, but it depends. It would work by itself as a black. If we're going to try and use this to mix with, it skews too blue. So the opposite, because we need to neutralize the blue right now to get it to black. The neutralizer, again, to reiterate from part one, the neutralizer to blue is a mixture of the other two primary colors, red, yellow, orange. To neutralize blue, we use orange. We need a little bit more orange in this mixture to get it to a closer neutral, which is too black. So let's mix a little bit of orange. And let's slowly mix some of that orange in. Because if we go too orange, we're going to change it to more of a brown. And we don't want a brown, we want a black. A brown, if you take a brown, by the way, and you spread it really thin over a canvas or a substrate, whatever it happens to be, and you observe it carefully, most browns are really just dark oranges. So if, for instance, we had on our palette burnt umber, which is often referred to as a brown, that is really a dark orange. We could have added a little bit of burnt umber to our mix and made a nice black from that. In fact, once you start getting used to mixing a black and you get really comfortable using this primary palette, one of the colors that I recommend if you're going to add might be either a raw umber or a burnt umber. Okay, we'll talk about that more in depth in a later video. Now, this looks pretty good to me. It's hard to tell when our paint is just a dark paint what it is. We saw that in the last video. So one of the ways we can tell, is this a nice neutral black, or is it still skewing a little too much either to any side, yellow, red, or blue? We're going to take a little bit of white And we are just going to mix it with a little bit of white to see. It's still skewing a tiny bit blue. Let's take just a little bit more. I want to wipe. I'm wiping my palette knife, by the way, in between before I dip back into our black, because I don't really want to get white in it in the main pile. If we wanted to leave it here, we could leave it here, but it's skewing a tiny, tiny, tiny bit blue. So we're going to mix a little bit more of this orange in. And when I say a little bit, I mean a little bit. Do this a little bit at a time until you're really used to how the pigments interact with each other. And I really can't reiterate that enough. Because sometimes you really only just need a tiny little bit, and especially when you start working with artist grade paints. Those pigments, a lot of times, I'm sorry about that. Those pigments are very strong, usually. Not all of them, but generally speaking, they're much stronger than student grade pigments. So you will only have to add tiny little bits to your mixtures to change them. And you just want to be mindful of that. And then there's also just the fact that the more you use to try and correct, you may overcorrect, and then you're going to have to use more and more and more, and your pile's going to grow and grow and grow. And you don't need to do that. Let's take a little bit of this and mix some more of that into the white. All right, so now okay, I would say we're pretty close. Let me do this. Let me get rid of this. Let's just, for the sake of brevity, wipe that down. Take a little bit more of this. Put some here. Let's take a little bit of white. Some here. That's better. Okay. So you see, with that tiny little adjustment, we were able to get it pretty darn close to neutral. It's pretty close. We're going to leave our black at that, and we're going to take our black, what we just mixed, and put it up here, because we are going to use that black. But you see how easy it is to mix a chromatic black. It's really not hard. It doesn't take that much practice. It takes a little bit of practice, but not that much, before you're confident at saying, I would try and keep this gray, but there's really not a lot of it here. So let me just clean the palette. Let me just wipe it back, because when we're doing these things, when we're mixing, and I've said this before in previous videos, use a large enough palette so that you always have room to work without doing what I'm doing right now, which is having to clean off a bunch of areas. I'm doing it right now because I just don't want to confuse people with what we're doing. Okay, so, but you should use a big enough palette so you don't really have to do this. You could just move a pile over and be done with it, and do a quick wipe and you're good. But honestly, when we're painting, sometimes we don't want to be that meticulous, because getting those little gradations and variations, slight variations in your mixture, that is sometimes what really gives a painting character. When you look at something in nature, if you look at, my face right now, it's not one color. There's a lot going on in there. So when you vary tiny little bits, even like, here's a little bit of orange, right? Here's a little orange. Here's some red. There's red in here. And they vary with the light, with the contour of my face. So it is good to vary. And that's why I say, I really suggest you don't think about color mixing as being formulaic, because then you're putting yourself into like a box, and you don't want to do that. You want to be able to be flexible enough to understand and to see there are slight variations, and it's okay to vary it. The questions become a question of value most of the time. Have I pushed my value too dark or too light in that area? The shift in hue isn't always a really big deal. And if you go to the museum and you take a look at some of the masters' works, you will see what I'm talking about. Okay, let's continue, because I know you didn't tune in for a lecture on the current exhibit that I'm high on right now, by the way, and anybody who knows me knows what I'm talking about. I just got back recently from one of my favorite museums, seeing an exhibit of one of my favorite artists. I might talk about it a little bit, but not right now. Okay, so one of the things we're going to use the black that we just mixed for is to make a gray. We may want to use a gray when we're mixing. And that mixing a gray into a color, especially a purer color, is known as tinting. You've probably heard of it. You've probably heard the word used. You've probably heard tinting, toning, and shading. The tinting, toning. The toning part of that is when you mix a gray. I'm sorry, I said tinting, toning. So to tone a color note means to add a neutral gray to it. So we probably should mix a gray that is a neutral at what I would consider on the value scale, in the middle of the value scale. See here. We have I'm going to go a tiny bit darker in here. So I also think it's important that you understand that also I am not a subscriber of the notion that you should not have black, as in a black pigment, on your palette. Indeed, blacks come in very handy. They do a lot of things. All of these things I look at as tools. And when we can use the tool, we should use it. Otherwise, we're being foolish. So I'm not one of these people who says you should never have black on your palette. But for now, learn to mix a black, because sometimes it is in service of the painting it's in better service of a painting to mix a black. And it's not necessarily from 3 of the primary colors. It could be from mixing something like alizarin crimson, which is a red, a beautiful transparent red with a beautiful transparent green, like either Viridian or phthalo green. That makes a beautiful black also, a very beautiful black. So there are ways, other ways to make blacks, and I put that in air quotes. I'm gonna leave that. That's about as dark as I want to go with the gray. So let's now take this gray. I put that in air quotes because we're not necessarily making, let's put our gray, and we could put the gray right below the black here. We're not necessarily making a black per se. Sometimes when we're doing a painting, we want the color note that we're mixing to appear as a black. That is to say that it's very dark, and unless you put a black next to it, you really wouldn't know that it's not a black, like an ivory black or a Mars black or a lamp black. You wouldn't know it, because if we're not putting that pigment next to it, it's going to appear black in the painting. And so understanding that, I use the word black, generally speaking. And those are good things to know how to mix and good things to know how to use and when to use them. But again, that's not part of this discussion. Today we're going to just focus on, again, color mixing. So let's do this. Let's do some color mixing. So what I recommend the beginners start with is going to the hardware store or paint store and getting yourself swatches and learning how to match from these. And again, because you're using a limited palette, you may or may not be able, and you're going to get to know this very quickly, you may or may not be able to match the note 100%. You may be able to come close, but because of the limitations of your palette, because of the limitations of the pigments, you may not be able to match a note. I'm looking at this note right here, which is called New Avocado, by the way. I'm not sure which brand of paint it is. I believe it's a Valspar paint. Knowing this palette, I'm pretty sure we can get really close, if not 100%. But understand that it's good to do this using the same palette over and over, color palette, that is the same pigments over and over, until you really get used to them. Then you can start adding pigments, because once your eyes become sensitive to how color mixing works, you're going to be able to tell, I need a different red here if I'm going to match that note, or I need to add a yellow to match that note for this painting. You're going to get to recognize this if you practice a lot with the primary palette and you allow your sensibilities to develop by doing that. And the reason I say just stick with a primary palette using only 3 primaries is because it just clears a lot of confusion. It eliminates a lot of potential problems as a result of using too many pigments. So don't get upset with yourself if you can't match a note 100%. If you get close enough, understand that by adding different pigments sometimes you can match it 100%. So go easy on yourself, but try and get as close as possible. Okay? And speaking of such, let's do that right now. This is a green, so let's start by mixing a green. And green is a combination of blue and yellow. So let's take some blue and some yellow and start mixing a green. And I'd say that green skews to the yellow side, and in fact you might call it a yellow. I would call it more of a green, but you might look at it and say yellow. That has some blue in it. So as you can see here, also it's probably a really good idea to try and match a value first. And the way that means the light, how light or dark is the color, right? How light or dark is that note that we're trying to hit? And there are two ways to lighten, because we need to lighten it right now. Our value, this value is darker than this value. There are two ways to lighten a note, and that is with white or yellow. This is still too blue when compared, remember everything's comparative, when compared to the note we're trying to match here, it's still too blue. So I'm going to use more yellow. And let's try and get to the value first. It's starting to come down in value, and it's also we're getting closer in value, and we're getting closer to the color note too. By the way, if you've been practicing with the same color palette that I recommend, our white is melting again. You'll notice that Cadmium Yellow Medium skews a little bit red. We can see that this is not a very high chroma color, so it's not a very bright green or yellow, whichever way you want to look at it. Again, these are labels that work more for you as an individual than as an objective way of looking at things. I see it as a green. You may see it as a yellow. Regardless, it is not very high chroma, and we would all recognize that. So the yellow that we start with, which is still a high chroma yellow, it does skew a little red, and red is what? Red is the neutralizer for green. So when we mix this particular yellow into this mixture, it's also reducing the chroma a little bit. And we're actually getting fairly close. We're still not at what I would consider a matching value yet. We're still darker. We're gonna add even a little more yellow. We're gonna add a little more yellow let's see where we're going here. All right, so now I can see we're probably going to, at this point, because of the chroma, we're probably going to have to start using white at this point to get to the value we're trying to hit, because we're starting possibly to go a little too yellow. But you know what? Let's experiment and use a little more yellow, because we could always correct it. We can always correct this. Very rarely are we going to do something that we can't correct, that we're just going to completely have to wipe off the palette and start over. Although I would suggest that you don't really wipe it off the palette. I suggest that you just take it and move it aside, because you're probably, if you're doing a painting, by the way, I'm saying, take it and move it to the side. You're probably going to have use for it later on somewhere in the painting. So even if you had to do that, which is very rare, because you should always be able to get back to where you need to go. Sometimes if you add a little too much titanium white tends to be chalky. So if you add a little too much, sometimes it's hard to get back to a chroma you need to get at, but again, I don't want to get into that. Most of the time, can't make a mistake that we can't get ourselves out of. Okay. Let's go even a little bit more yellow. So now I think we're going a little too yellow. I think we skewed a little too yellow, because our mixture here, when compared to the note we're trying to match, looks a little bit too yellow and a little bit too orange. Okay? Specifically to match that note. So that means we're going to need to add what? If it's a little too orange, we need to add a little bit blue. So we're going to add just a tiny little bit of blue back into it. And what does that also mean? It means that we're going to have to start using white, because the blue is going to make the value darker. So we absolutely are going to have to use white to match that color note. So let's do a little bit of white. What I'm using here is just simple reasoning to match a color. We're not having to think about formulas or anything. It's a little too orange. We needed to add blue. Blue is going to make it darker. We're trying to match a value. Means we're going to have to use white. So let's take a little bit of white. Start with little bits. If you're using a titanium white has a higher tinting strength than the white I am using. So if you're using a titanium white, which is actually what I suggest you use because it's inexpensive and it's probably the two whites, the two main whites that I suggest using are either lead white, which again can vary, but a white made from lead, or a white made from titanium. They have two different properties. I'm not going to get into them now, but they also are two different price points. Titanium white is way less expensive than lead white. So I would suggest you either use a titanium white, or Winsor & Newton sells what's called a soft mixing white, which also, like lead white, has a little bit of a lower tinting strength. Lead white has a much lower tinting strength, but some people, don't want to spend the money on lead white because it is more expensive, especially when you're learning. If you were in an atelier, you'd probably need to use lead white. But if you're learning on your own, use titanium white. It's less expensive, but do it with the understanding that if you use a different white, you may have to recalibrate your sensibilities a tiny little bit. You know? Okay, so here, what I'm seeing is we're still a little bit too orange. So I want to add a little bit more blue in here. And remember, I said we did that. We added yellow a couple of times, where I would have started to add white. But that's because I've been doing this for a while. So I know where I need to start adding white, and when I, can continue to use something like yellow to bring my value closer to a lighter value. Anyway, so let's take a little bit of blue, a little bit at a time. There's a little bit of blue in here. And our value is a little bit darker than our target note still. But it still appears too orange to me, so it's slightly orange to me. I want to add a little bit more blue. And I also want to add some white because our value is still not correct. Here. Okay, so what do you think, folks? That is a pretty close match right there. I would say if you were just starting and you hit that note, it's close. It's not 100%. It's close. So with respect to value right now, I would say that our value in the puddle is still a little dark and possibly still a little orange, let's add some white, just a little bit more white, just so you can see what I'm talking about when we shift things and how we really should. I would encourage you to get in the habit of shifting them slowly. That means not adding a whole, like, don't necessarily add a big pile of white into it, because to me, if you take a little bit more time, you will start getting used to slight shifts. And that gets really important when you are trying to render something accurately from nature. If you do it in small little shifts, your eyes are going to start recognizing those very, very slight shifts. And that becomes important later on. Okay, well, I think that note looks pretty close. And I would say, if you got that, you have been successful at matching that new avocado note. Okay, let us keep going. So you see, it's not really that hard. It's really not hard. Also, I do suggest you start with things like this, these cards, because it is much less distracting if you can just focus on one single note without other distractions around you. Like when we look at a piece of fruit, for instance, that has, you take an apple, a red apple. A red apple could be so many slight variations of red, it's confusing when you first start. You do need to learn to see those things, but why put yourself at a disadvantage when you're beginning? That doesn't make any sense. Put yourself at an advantage. Try and match things that are just uniform in hue and value and saturation. Do that first. These cards are really good at doing that. So let's clean this off. I'm going to put it over here. We're probably not going to need it, but let's put it over there, because I may use it later. I'm not going to lie. I might use it later to do something. Match, do a study, I don't know. You never know. It's also because it's oil paint. And again, let me reiterate, I use oil paint. I use acrylics. I do use watercolor occasionally, gouache. Primarily I'm acrylics and oils. But this way of thinking applies to any pigment matching. Because I'm using oils, they stay what's called open. I'll use another term. It's not technically what it is, but wet, right? We call it wet. It's not wet with water, it's wet with oil. They stay open, which means they stay workable and wet. They don't, quote unquote, dry quickly. So I usually take my leftover paints, as long as they are not crusty and flaky and nasty. And I use them as long as I can. Sometimes I just put them in the freezer on a pallet. I put them in the freezer. And you can use oil paints or even acrylics. You can do the same thing with acrylics. It's just that acrylics dry much quicker. They close quicker. You could do the same thing if your acrylic paint on a palette, and if they're still wet, you could cover that palette with some kind of wrap, or put it in a Tupperware or something, put it in the freezer, take it out the next day and use it. It's fine. They'll work. So I like doing that. I don't like wasting paints. All right, let's do another color. Let's do another one. Let's do, oh, this is, I just love the name of this one. This one is called Sassy Lilac. Sassy Lilac. And Sassy Lilac, I believe, is a I'm not sure who this manufacturer is. Because honestly, I don't look at the manufacturer. I just pick cards. I pretend I'm looking at paint and thinking about paints, but I'm not. I don't care who it is. Anyway, let's match Sassy Lilac. And Sassy Lilac, right, is, we don't care about the name. So what color do I see before me? I see a purple that skews a tiny, I don't know. I don't even know if I would say it skews to the blue side or the red side. Looks like a really nice purple. So how do we make purple? Blue. It's a violet, by the way, because it's got a lot of white in it. So it's not a purple, it's a violet. We're going to take a blue, but we're going to start with a purple, and then we're going to put white in it. Let's start with a purple. Just to get some color mixed in there. Let's go for the value. So we're going to need a lot of white. We are also, it might be hard to see. It might be hard to see in the video. But we are also going to need a little bit of yellow in there. And you'll see that once I just start mixing white in. You'll see that it actually is more neutralized than just blue and red. So the neutralizer for purple is yellow, and we are going to need a little bit of yellow, but let's get to our value. And since our puddle is darker, we know we are going to need more white. Let's get a little bit more white. And if you were using titanium white, you wouldn't need to use as much. So I'm pulling a little bit more out because of the white that I am using. But I would like you to understand that you may need to use less white. Than I am using right now. So I don't want you to think, oh, if I pull a little bit out, because Bones pulled a little bit out, you may need to use a little bit more of something or a little bit less of something. That's why everyone needs to practice with their palette. I don't know what paints you're going to buy. Every manufacturer is a little bit different. I don't know if you're going to be using student grade or if you're going to be using professional grade paints, artist grade paints, boutique paints. I don't know My assumption is that you are going to choose whatever is best for your skill level and budget combined, but just understand that different pigments have different characteristics. The generalities are what we're working with right now. But you may need to use a little bit more or a little bit less of any given pigment. So don't try and take notes on how much I'm grabbing out of a pile. Just know that you should start slowly and build up to matching the color note. You won't have to do it later. Once you get used to it, you could mix very quickly to match a color note. Because it's just going to happen. And you keep doing this and you'll see that I'm telling you the truth. Okay, let's add a little bit more white in because our value is still too dark. We're almost there, but not quite. And I can see that we are definitely going to need a little bit of yellow in there. So we're not quite at the value. Let's hit the value note, the value first, the value aspect of the note, the color note. I refer to these things as color notes. And a note is a combination of hue, value, and intensity or saturation. Working on the value aspect of this note, and we still have to bring it a little bit lighter. We're almost there. Almost, not quite. Let's go up a little more. Raising the value. Okay, so now we're closer. I would say let's leave it at this value because it's pretty close. It's hard to see. And kind of apologize. I didn't know this color was going to be that hard to see. The value is pretty close, but it definitely, and I hope this comes through on the video. I'm not sure if it's coming through as clearly on the video as I would like it to, but it needs a little bit of yellow. So I'm going to add a little bit of yellow, a little bit of yellow. And that even might be a little too much, but let's see. Let's see. Well, it may be too much. It may have been a little too much yellow. So let's go. Let's just add a tiny little bit of purple back in, because that's the neutralizer for yellow. So one of the reasons too, remember I said the yellow that we're using skews a little bit red? Well, that skew red might keep us from matching 100%, let's say, or accurately this particular note, but that's okay. Understanding that is what's important, and not getting frustrated if you're not reaching the note. All right, so let's see. We need a little bit more. I see a little bit more red that needs to go in here. Reds generally speaking, have a high tinting strength. So a lot of times we don't need a lot of red if we're just trying to reach, if we're close to a note and we're trying to reach it and we see, the target looks a little more red. I would add very little to start, which is what I just did. We may need to add a little bit more, but we also need to still raise the value a little bit. It's still a little too dark. Let's bring it up a little bit more. Another thing that you could do also, or at least be mindful of, let's say you're working on a painting and you're having a little trouble matching a color note. Your pile's starting to grow, which means you're going to have to use more pigment to shift the pile. You could always take the pile and cut it in half, move some of it out of the way to go back in and say, all right, let's see what we can do to shift this a little bit easier, right? Let's say you only needed to put on a little stroke. You just needed a little bit. I don't want to necessarily mix into that big pile because it's going to require more pigment to shift it. And then I'm getting into wasting paint, and I don't like doing that. So if you're like me and you don't like to waste paint, cut your pile in half, move that half to the side. You're still going to use it more likely than not. You could use it to mix into other things when you're trying to match notes. So I don't mind doing that. Okay, we're getting closer. I see our value as being still not quite there. So this, I'm gonna, no, we're still not there in value. We're still a little dark over here, but I also see that our chroma, we may not be able to hit this note exactly. Okay, it still looks like it needs a little bit more purple. So remember what I said about white, especially titanium white. Titanium white really reduces chroma, which is another characteristic that you need to consider. You shouldn't say, I don't want to use titanium white because it does this, but you need to consider it and understand it. Titanium white reduces chroma more than, let's say, lead white, way more than lead white. Titanium white, when considering other aspects such as temperature, titanium white is cool as compared to most lead whites, which are warm. We're not going to get into that today in this video. We'll get into it in another video, but not this one. But these are things to consider. Okay, so we're a little bit it's really hard to see, I think. I don't think the camera's really translating it well. It's still a little bit too dark. And I'm not going to mix into the entire pile. I'm going to show you just the difference. And hopefully that comes through on the video and the camera. But you can see so our value is a little bit light, but also our chroma is still a little bit off. Let's go back in with a little bit more of the purple and see if we may even need a little bit more red in here. That is probably, and it's really hard to see, and I apologize. Maybe when it's next to it, it's a little bit better. That is getting closer. It's, again, still not 100%. It's close, but it's not 100%. It needs a little bit more white. Because our value got darker when I added, of course. So could use a little bit more white, but my instinct is telling me that with the colors on this palette, we're not going to match this one 100%. Let's add a little bit more white. See, I think our value went a little too light there. So our value is pretty close, but our chroma isn't, which tells me with these colors, we're not going to hit this note 100%. And so this is where I would be making my difficult decision. Do I keep trying to match this note by going back in with tiny little bit of blue, tiny little bit of red, and see, can I get closer to it? Or Is that going to be the best I can get from the use of this palette? My gut is we are not going to be able to match this 100% with this limited palette. And that's okay. But knowing that we're not going to match it avoids a lot of frustration and consternation and a lot of other Asians. Sometimes you just have to settle because we just don't have the pigments to match extremely accurately the note we're going for. That's about as good as we're going to get. And I'm sorry that I don't think it's translating that well. I didn't check this color with the camera and the lighting. But trust me, it's pretty close, but it's not a 100% match. But it's close. And we have to settle for close sometimes. Let me see if I can. Yeah, just in this light, it's really hard to see. It's pretty close, but it's not 100% match. But you could be happy with that match. You don't have to be disappointed that you weren't able to match it. Some high value, high chroma notes are really hard to match it. And unless you're using certain high chroma pigments to start with, and it depends. It's not a secret. It's not something that is going to be revealed in a later video. It's not this. There's no tricks. You have to train your eye to see these things. And I thought there was a possibility we could match that particular note when we started, but it's not going to make it. But that's okay, because I like to show also that you have to learn to see these things, and after a while you will trust your instinct. Like, to be honest, I would not have used, because I don't use this as my standard palette anymore. I stopped using this palette and I've altered my palette a little bit. I use different colors. I still use ultramarine all the time. But I don't always use this yellow, this cadmium yellow medium, or this cadmium red medium. And I almost never use them by themselves. So if I were going to start out trying to match this color, I also use alizarin crimson, or a variation thereof, on my palette. I would not have used a cadmium red to start trying to match this color, because to my eye it is much closer to a crimson, a permanent alizarin, or a magenta, which also I don't use on my palette. I use a variation of alizarin crimson, and that is what I would have used for that. But that's not what the exercise is about. That's for later, when you understand better how to color match, to match a note. And you're going to go through phases, by the way, where you're going to start using a pigment or a color that you like, and you're going to experiment, and hopefully that's what you do. Experiment. Once you get comfortable, you start challenging yourself again by using different pigments, new pigments. And it will be a challenge because they will have different properties, mixing properties, and it's fun actually when you're doing that. I would not recommend doing that if you're doing a commission or you're trying to achieve a particular thing, and you need to be efficient. You need to use the tools that you're most familiar with if you have something like a deadline or a particular idea in mind, and you need to rely on efficiency. But honestly, that is what I would have done if I were going to try and match that color with my usual palette. I would have used a different red and probably even a different yellow. But I don't want to get into why. Just know that once you start getting familiar, getting more comfortable, getting more confident, you will see these things. Your eyes will tell you this is not going to work with your palette. If you want to match this note, you better add something, and then you'll know how to make that decision as you continue to grow. But for now, just practice this. Let's do one more. I know that we're pushing time right now. Way longer than I wanted it to be. Let's do smoked oyster. So what I see here is something that is, it's almost a neutral, but it isn't. And it's a good thing that we mixed this very neutral gray to begin with, because I'm going to show you that it isn't, but it does look like it is. This is our neutral gray. And let's actually start with this, because it's also fun. We know that it's going to be a very neutralized color. So this, compared to this, looks a lot bluer, doesn't it? You don't need to be able to necessarily, everything again is relational. We're relating this to this. We're comparing this to this. Everything in painting and drawing is comparative in nature. It's what's going on here that's important, not necessarily what we see elsewhere. This looks bluer than this, much bluer. So we need to neutralize the blue by doing what? Adding its complementary color, which is a combination of the other two primaries, because we're talking about one of the primaries. It looks too blue, so we're gonna make orange, right? We need to add the other two primary colors. Let's take a little bit of the orange that we mixed before and add some of that in. And ooh, look what it's doing. Look at that. It is very quickly doing something that looks magical, but it isn't. It is an illusion. Okay, we're getting closer to it. Now, if I were being honest about how I would reach it with my usual palette, I might go in here with a little bit of alizarin crimson to match that note. We're close already. but let's see. It still looks it still looks a little too blue. Let's see if you can, yeah. Hopefully that's coming through. It's a little too blue still. So let's add a little bit more orange. And how's our value? Our value is a little dark. So let's add a little bit of white. Raise the value. And the mixing white is a combination of titanium white and zinc white. Mixing white, like titanium white, shifts a little blue. So we're definitely going to have to, in addition to we said it was too blue before, now it is definitely too blue, so we need to mix some orange. Let's get more orange in here. So now what I'm seeing is our value is off. It is a little bit dark. I think let's try that again. The value's close. The value is close. It looks to me like, excuse me, like we need a tiny little bit of red in here. Let's take a little bit more red. And we're almost there. We're almost there. Not quite. Not quite. Let's compare what we see here. I have a visitor. I don't know if you could hear him. I don't even have to look at him. I know what he sounds like. That's my visitor. Jasper is in here. Jasper has graced us with his presence. So it looks to me like it still needs a little bit of orange. A little bit. Let's see if there's enough here to make a difference. There might be. There might be. But there might not be. I don't know. Let's find out. It's a mystery. It's always a mystery. I'm just kidding. It isn't. It's not mysterious. It's just a matter of getting used to training our sensibilities. That is actually a pretty close, it's a pretty close match. Let me see. Let's take a look here. I wish I was better with cameras. I'm just not. It's close. So up close, it's a little bit easier to tell because the light is more even. You see that? It's pretty close. It almost disappears. It almost disappears. The light is, when it catches it one way or the other, makes it look darker or lighter. But that's a lighting illusion right now. To my eye, it's actually very, very close. And again, I would have used an alizarin crimson, and I could probably match it dead on with an alizarin crimson. These colors skew a tiny little bit, so it's a little bit harder to match certain things. And when you get a little bit better and more confident at mixing and understanding when you can and can't reach a note is part of it. You're going to then expand your palette. So in a later video, I plan to talk about colors, pigments that are more pure. That is a yellow that doesn't, again, skew red or blue. It is more of a pure yellow. A red that doesn't skew yellow or blue is more of a pure red. And then there are some blues also, but again, ultramarine blue I almost always suggest having on your palette. It's a very nice dark blue that's been used for probably thousands of years. I'm a little curious. I want to mix a little bit of red in here. I want to see. Let's do experimenting. I also encourage you to do that. Like sometimes if you're just doing an exercise like this, push it and see what happens. So let's take a little bit of red because I still see a little bit of room for some more red in the mix to match the note better. Yeah, that matches it a little bit closer. And again, it's hard to tell. Let's see. It's kind of hard to tell. I do apologize. Trust me, that is a closer match with that little bit more of red. You can see that's where my OCD comes in. It was bothering me a little bit. All right, anyway, I digressed. I planned on doing 1 or 2 more, but I don't want this video running too long. I don't want you all to be bored to tears and never come back, because that guy makes videos that are just way too long. So, let's clean this up. And we can kind of wrap up this video. But you see that it's really not that difficult to learn how to do this. It's really not hard. I'm going to stress that it's important to use the same color palette over and over. So, i.e., pick a yellow, pick a red, pick a blue, and don't vary them. Unless you see, here's your little caveat, unless you see that through your experimentation, it's just skewing too much one way or another, and it's becoming frustrating for you because you're not able to match notes close enough. But pick a yellow, a red, and a blue and stick with it. Do these exercises with the colors you choose, the hues you choose, and do it until you're comfortable and confident with matching, because it's going to build your sensibilities and your sensitivities with respect to what you're seeing and how to match those notes with pigments. Once you can apply the elementary skills with confidence, you can start incorporating other aspects of color note matching. Like you can start thinking more about temperature, and I'm going to do a video on color temperature. But that's an aspect that when you're starting, you will notice it, but you may not know what you're noticing, but you're going to notice it. When you keep doing this over and over, these things are just going to happen. Excuse me. So let's wrap this up. I do hope this information and exercise will help you gain a better understanding about how to practically approach color note matching and further dispel the notion that color matching is intimidating because it's too difficult. I hope that if nothing else, I've done that with this video. It's not intimidating. It shouldn't be intimidating. It's not too difficult. It just requires you to make a bit of a commitment to practice, and to practice things that are going to help you meet your objective. This is a way to do it. Use a limited palette and just, like play games with matching color notes, right? I actually do this for fun sometimes because I'm a geek. That's what I do. You don't have to get super geeky with it, but I think if you're watching this and you sat all the way through, you probably are a bit like me and you're a bit geeky. And you will have fun with it. Anyway, I want to thank you very much for watching. Oh, look, here's another one. This is Raven. Raven is, let me get out of the, there's Raven. She wasn't supposed to be in the shot, but now she is. She wasn't even supposed to be in the room, but now she is. Anyway, Thank you very much for watching. And remember to please like and subscribe if you already haven't done that. And feel free to leave any questions or comments down below. My plan is to publish another video shortly toward the furtherance of this series on painting fundamentals and foundations. Once again, from me to you and Raven, thank you for watching. Come back soon. Raven, you little scallywag.